In one of my recent lives, I actually had someone request that I do a video on Taoism. I've actually done this before, about 12 years ago from the time this video is posted. However, one of the things that I've been considering recently is to review old videos that I've done and kind of either remake them or maybe clarify some of the things that I either didn't understand correctly at the time or if I had got more information and just kind of add to it. So that video is not too bad. I will admit it's a little bit bad as far as like the film quality and the sound quality. So yeah, it's basically something that needs to be redone at this point. It's still worth going to check out, so go ahead and put a link to it down in the description. Maybe I'll leave it up for a while, but I'm basically sitting on the floor and just talking about my current perspective when it comes to Taoism. So the approach that I want to take today is I want to step back and kind of take a high-level look at Taoism and then kind of clarify some of the things that I've learned since then, other things that I've run across, some sources as I always do, and just kind of have a general open conversation. Real high-level background of why I even know anything about Taoism at all. So ever since I was a kid, I've looked up and admired Bruce Lee. Many people have. My screen name, Blaze Lee Dragon, right? Bruce Lee was the little dragon. Bruce Lee, Blaze Lee, it's pretty straightforward. I've always been a huge fan of Bruce Lee. He's been a big inspiration in my life, not only his philosophy, but some of the technical details about how to approach martial arts and combat. So of course I looked and sought out Chinese martial arts, and I've studied various types of Chinese martial arts, including the internal, what they call Neidan arts. So I tried to find local schools and places online and read up on it the best I could. So I've studied Daiji Chuan, Pakwa Chuan, Xingyi Chuan, and I learned how to do like meditation and breathing. And I had a lot of local teachers give me insight on how they think about some of the Chinese philosophies. I've read books, articles, the usual stuff. I did a whole bunch of self-research to do the best I could to understand it. Now, with all of that being said, I'm going to have perspective that's going to be influenced by the way my teacher showed it to me, and I'm going to be influenced by the little bit that I can remember, because remember, back in the time I grew up, I was born in 81. So back in the 90s, there wasn't really a lot of resources. It was kind of like local teachers just believe what they have to say, or if you could find a local book or something. It was very difficult to do research back then. Well, with the Chinese martial arts, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Dedicated many years to it, on and off with different schools, different teachers. So I have a mixed perspective, a mixed bag. So a lot of the stuff that I'm going to bring to you today basically is stuff that I remember, including things that I mentioned in my original video, and then me going out to try to find some people will call it confirmation bias. I'm just trying to re-evaluate the information I have, not just to confirm that it was right, but if I'm wrong, I want to know that as well. So for this specific video, I'm going to try to stay as focused as I can. I don't want this to turn into hours, because I could easily talk about this topic for hours because there's just so much information out there and different interpretations. So the first thing I want to introduce is the idea of there are different types of Tao, and there's different types of Taoism. Now, a lot of people might not agree with this. This is just my personal interpretation, but basically I consider there to be two major types of Taoism. The first type of Taoism is the religious Taoism. And the second type of Taoism is the spiritual or philosophical Taoism, which some would probably argue is not true Taoism. And if you're one of them, you know what? You're entitled to your opinion, but this is my video, so deal. So with Taoism, I'm separating it between religious and philosophical for two main reasons. The first reason is there's actual sects in China that are dedicated to different forms of Taoism. We're talking with words that translate into priest. They have religious, spiritual ceremonies, everything from writing out these kind of magical talismans that they call fu. There is different types of chanting and prayers, mantras, meditations that they do. There are some who will wear priestly robes. They will take wooden jian, which is a type of sword. It's like a straight sword with a double edge, and they will put some of these symbols in Chinese on them as well. There's a great big ritualistic approach to it, and it depends on the sect that is practicing that form of Taoism, and there's going to be some variances. I have tried to reach out to two different sects with Taoist priests, and I tried to ask if I could learn. One of them was very resistant and kind of pushed away. The other one was all for it, but said I had to give up everything else I did religiously and spiritually and only take on Taoism, which I wasn't willing to do. So I have a very limited understanding of the religious practices. It's very high level. It's from an outsider's perspective. And it's something that if you want more of, I will cover in a future video, including some of the interactions that I had, which was interesting to say the least. Now, the other thing to understand about Taoism is something that I think is true for Chinese folk traditions, period, and that is it is very ingrained in the culture. So the way that a Westerner, like myself, would approach any form of Taoism, whether it's religious or philosophical, is going to be influenced by our Western perspective, and it's going to be different. And this is one of the reasons that some will argue that a Westerner can't really practice true Taoism. Again, depends on the person you speak with. Culture is much bigger than people are willing to acknowledge. They grew up in their culture. They have a way of looking at things, and they're going to try to not only translate the language into the way that they can comprehend it based upon their understanding, but there's not always going to be a one-for-one translation of the words. An example of something that I'll get into later is the three treasures. And one of those is qi. A lot of people have heard of qi, and a lot of people try to say, oh, that's spiritual energy. That's life force. And that's not really a really great interpretation of it. In fact, it probably closer translates to the word breath in English. And there's more to us as spiritual beings than just qi from a Chinese perspective. There's actually 3 different prime energies, and then there's multiple souls as well. Again, it's a different concept because the cultural differences. So that's something to keep in mind. So even from a philosophical standpoint, those who are actually Chinese and grew up in that culture versus Westerners are going to even take the philosophical approach to a different level and a different understanding, and they're going to modify it. So what we're doing over here in the West, or trying to do, myself included, is going to look foreign and different than someone who actually lives in China. I will briefly point out here that there are multiple dialects in China. Like, for example, it's not just the Chinese language. There's Mandarin and there's Cantonese, and there's probably other ones. Mandarin and Cantonese are the only 2 that I know of. I'm not fluent in either. I know more words in Mandarin than Cantonese, and Cantonese is much more difficult to pronounce, in my opinion, because they have 8 tones versus the 4 tones. You don't necessarily need to learn Mandarin in order to study something like Taoism, but you're going to have to rely on translators. And as I mentioned in all of my videos, and just mentioned in this one, when you translate, you are going to lose some meaning. So you do want to look at different translators, even if you're translating the same types of text, in order to inspire your personal practice if you are wanting to study and practice Taoism versus just research it. And because I can't resist using any of the words that I know in foreign languages whenever I have an opportunity, 我会说一点普通话，可是我说得不好. Now, if you speak Mandarin, yes, I realize my accent is bad, my pronunciation is a little bit off. If you do not speak Mandarin, I literally just said I speak a little Mandarin, but I don't speak it well. All right, if you're still here, you stuck through a lot of the intro stuff, so let's kind of dig into it a little bit more and talk about the philosophical approach to Taoism. Now, one of the things that I had mentioned in my previous video is I talked about Nianzhu, which is basically prayer beads. They're called mala beads in Buddhism. So it's a Buddhist practice. And once again, it's ingrained in the culture. So in China, they would have practiced Chan Buddhism, but we're not talking about Buddhism. We're talking about Taoism. So why am I bringing this up? Because in my last video, I mentioned using them for a Taoist practice. You can incorporate it, but again, it's not actually part of the Taoist practice, even if it is culturally within China because of Chan Buddhism and some of its influences. With the invention of Taoism, so as I understand it, there was many warring periods in China, and there was a lowering of how to act in civilization, and people were becoming more cruel. So it is said that Li Er, who is better known as Lao Tzu, wrote a book on basically how to act known as the Tao Te Ching. Now, the Tao Te Ching is a philosophical book of basically life lessons, wisdom sayings, and a lot of people attribute it to being one of the core texts of Taoism. I would argue it is one of the core texts of philosophical Taoism versus religious Taoism, but again, we'll talk about religious Taoism in a future video just because I have less knowledge of it. Lao Tzu, as I said in my last video, basically means old master or wise teacher. It's a title versus a name. His name was Li Er. Now, he could have his own video, so I won't say much about him other than the fact that he was the author of the Tao Te Ching, and a lot of people, especially in the West, that are interested in Taoism will turn to the Tao Te Ching for starting their journey into Taoism. Tao itself can be spelled one of two ways. It can be spelled in English as Tao or Dao. You can pretty much spell it however you want, but the sound itself is usually Tao. So it's not quite a D and it's not quite a T. It's not Tao, it's Tao. At least that's how I pronounce it with my American accent. With the Tao, Tao basically translates into way or path. So the idea with philosophical Taoism is to try to view the path through life, to try to understand the way, which is the most natural way of being without interfering with the natural course of existence. I want to quote one of the translations from the Tao Te Ching, which of course is attributed to Lao Tzu. Now it's worth mentioning that Lao Tzu might not have been the only person who wrote the Tao Te Ching, and that there was a large influence about the Tao Te Ching that also influenced Chan Buddhism, etc. So there's a lot of controversy around that. That's why I'm saying he probably should just deserve his own video altogether. But anyway, basically what it says is, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. Every desireless one can see is the mystery. Ever desiring one can see the manifestations. The two spring from the same source but differ in name. This appears as darkness. Darkness within darkness. The gate to all mystery. In essence, the way that I've understood this particular excerpt from it is the idea that the Tao itself can't really be talked about. It's something that you experience and you seek within. Someone can't tell you how to be a Taoist or how to find the way, how to find the path. They can simply give you guidance for looking within to find the path for yourself. That's the way I have at least looked at it. And those who try to name or limit it or try to construct the Tao into something understandable and simplistic is missing it. They're looking beyond what the actual Tao is, the eternal Tao. All right, so this video is going to get way too long, so I'm now going to try to jump into some broad concepts to introduce you to them. And again, if individuals like this interact with the video, I will produce future videos that go into more detail about the individual topics themselves. So let's talk about the three treasures and the three jewels, which some people say are the same thing, but I've heard two different lists. One of the lists, which I've heard referred to as the three jewels, is compassion, moderation, and humility. And there are full deep dive sections explaining what these three concepts mean. These are different than the three treasures, which are like the three gifts that were given at birth. And that is Qi, Jing, and Shen, which now we're starting to tap into my martial arts training. So there's a combination of what I learned from my teachers and my continued quest to find more knowledge and information on it by doing additional research on my own. So the basic idea behind these three, especially within the martial arts community, because martial arts itself is a Taoist practice, especially when you talk about Qigong or Daiji Chuan, because these are types of Neidan, internal alchemy, different things to cultivate internal energy. We are born with Jing. Jing is our physical body, basically. It is finite. It is something that we're given, and while we're here, it is depleted and it doesn't get replenished. Besides for the Jing energy, which is kind of manifested in our physical body or physical form, we also have Qi, which is like the breath, the intent, the internal flow of energy that flows throughout. If you think of the bloodstream as the Jing, some people will think of Qi flowing along meridians as a spiritual equivalent of that. So when you want to move and lift your hand, you are doing that through Qi. You're doing that through your will, through your intent. And there are different techniques for utilizing Jing and Qi within martial arts. Now, again, this can be its own video, so I'll pause there, but just understand that there's these two different types of energies. Then there is a byproduct of these two energies, which is called Shen, which kind of radiates off the body. My one teacher actually told me that Qi never leaves the body. So Qi is all about physical connection and feeling. So when you are doing push hands in Daiji Chuan or Taoshu, you are basically feeling that person's chi, but you were physically in contact with them. You're not pushing them over with chi because you're launching energy out of your hand. You'd almost take it from a physics standpoint. You're taking where their balance is and where their presence of mind is, and you're uprooting them to try to redirect their balance and knock them over type of a situation. This also plays into generating Fa Jing, which is like this sudden burst of energy used in martial arts. The Shen energy, like I said, kind of radiates. That's your spiritual essence and your spiritual presence. And when you are born with Jing, you can cultivate your chi. You start with an amount of chi, and based upon how much physical exercise you do to generate and cultivate your Jing, strengthen it and make it stronger, you also develop your chi, your breath, your endurance, and your will and your intent. And then you start radiating more Shen because you cultivate your chi and Jing. That's kind of a really dumbed down version of doing it. And like I said, we can deep dive that later. But the idea of cultivating internal energy and vibrations, such as with chi, is very much rooted in philosophical and, as I understand it, religious Taoism. In fact, one of the priests that I specifically spoke with talked heavily about cultivation of chi and different techniques that they would use and teach you if you were to join their Taoist sect. So, but again, that's more future videos. Look at all these teases like, hey, we'll talk about this later because we're already spending so much time on this. Another concept which is also utilized both inside of martial arts and Chinese folk traditions in general is what's called the Wuxing. The Wuxing is the 5 elements, and I've mentioned this in other videos before, of China. So let's translate them to English and not try to butcher the Chinese Mandarin pronunciation of these. You have wood, fire, metal, water, and earth. And with these 5 elements, there is a cycle of both creation and a cycle of destruction. The cycle of creation, basically each one of these elements will generate and create another element. And the cycle of destruction is those elements that destroy each other. A real quick example, because I don't want to spend too much time on the Wuxing right now. Again, future video, if folks are interested, comment below. Water puts out fire. Pretty straightforward. That's part of the cycle of destruction. Metal destroys wood, because think about an axe chopping down a tree. But then the reverse, right? So if you burn wood, it turns into ash, and those ashes becomes the earth. So that creates the earth. Metal is created out of the earth, if you think of like ore from the ground. So there's this, again, there's these cycles and these interactions, and there's this huge thing, including feng shui, wind and water, and it's talking about basically how this interplays with the vibrations in your house. Like all of this stuff is interconnected based upon the essence of these elements and how they interact with each other and having a deep understanding. But again, all philosophical and touches into some of the religious aspects. And a lot of this is ingrained in Chinese culture. As I understand it, I'm not Chinese, so maybe all of this is just stated as being part of Chinese culture, and maybe they've moved away from a lot of it from the past. Maybe modern China doesn't do any of this stuff and doesn't know much about it. I don't know. Since we're nearing the 20-minute mark, I'm going to go into some broad categories and concepts that I understand based upon philosophical Taoism, and then we'll wrap up the video. So we talked about Tao, meaning way or path. There's also this concept which is called Wu Wei. Wu Wei basically means no action or effortless action. It's the concept of letting things just be. There's, of course, yin and yang, which many people have heard of. Some people say yang. I understand it is always being pronounced yang because that's just how you pronounce it in Mandarin. Yin and yang, I've heard debates. So some folks that I've talked to swear up and down it has to do with time, like almost calendar related with the seasons, right? So from dark to light, and spring and summer, fall and winter, and how it's cycling through and the different variances on it. Some people think that they're opposing forces. Others will talk about it as being the 2 different aspects of energy of pushing and pulling, male and female. There's a lot of detailed conversations we can have around yin and yang. 2 of the main texts that I'm familiar with is, of course, the Tao Te Ching. I also have 365 Tao, which is just kind of wisdom sayings, and I've mentioned that in my last video. I can talk about that in the future. But there's also Zhuang Zhuo. I might be mispronouncing that a little bit, but basically it's a text that contains stories and philosophical musings to expand upon Taoist thought. We mentioned already that practices that they might do might be like meditation or Daiji Chuan, Qigong, or the internal alchemy, which is sometimes referred to as Neidan or Waidan. Now, one of the things I want to mention really quick at a very high level, Qigong is talking about Qi, like one of those three energies that we talked about, Jing, Qi, and Shen. Tai Chi, it's not Tai Chi, it's Taiji. Daiji Chuan is different than Daiji. Daiji is its own philosophical viewpoint of spirituality, and it translates to grand ultimate. Daiji Chuan is the martial art practice you see a lot of people doing slowly out in the park and stuff. That's actually one way of practicing Daiji Chuan, but it actually is a full combat system and can be used for self-defense. We can debate this in future videos, but with Daiji Chuan, grand ultimate fist, G, like a J-I, is a better phonic way of doing it than CHI, because then people get confused with Qi like in Qigong or Qi like the breath energy. So just to be clear that that's a very different piece and a different thing, but something that is commonly practiced with different types of Taoists. There is the religious aspect, not only with rituals and ceremonies, but they actually talk about the immortals and different stories about how the immortals became immortal, and there are different types of deities and spirits. So there is a large deep dive on the religious aspect that I don't know a whole lot about, but at least have a basic understanding of. There's been a lot of influence and spread about Taoism throughout the world in different cultures. It has influenced politics and literature, medicine, arts, like, paintings and sculptures and stuff, as well as the martial arts themselves, which I also mentioned. I also wanted to talk a little bit about different kind of concepts besides for just Wu Wei, which I mentioned was basically non-action or non-doing, letting things be. There's this longer version of it, which you say Wu Wei, Wu Bu Wei, which is basically action through inaction. It's the understanding that the world basically is perfect in and of itself. You don't have to always interact and force things to happen. Like you let water flow. Just let it do its natural course. And when you can understand this, you can start achieving what they call the state of Pu, which is this naturalness is probably the best way I can try to translate it. It's like the concept of a log being a log. Well, you just be a person, you understand your state of naturalness, and you're no longer enforcing your will on the world. You're simply being a part of the world. So that's my high-level crash course on modern philosophical Western viewpoint on Taoism, based upon some of my experiences and interactions. There's a lot of pieces I brought up inside this video, and it's been a pretty long one, all things considered. So if you would like me to deep dive one of these concepts, or if you have some counterpoints to some of the things that I've mentioned, please let me know, and I'd be happy to discuss them further in future videos. It's definitely something I've researched and been passionate about for some time, but just be aware when you are looking at things that are foreign from a Western perspective, you are going to get a Western influence and interpretation on them. So this is just the best way I understand them personally from my own experience. As always, I appreciate your support and views. Feel free to jump into the comments below. Just be respectful, because if you're going to be a jerk, I'm just going to delete your comment anyway. But if you want to have a nice open conversation, even if you disagree with me, I welcome different insights and I welcome different resources. So feel free to jump in the comments and we'll go ahead and discuss things further. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.